This is the Dallas Morning News.
Welcome to the second season of Beyond Talking Points. I'm Abby McCloskey. We're here to talk all about the first 100 days of the second Trump administration. And today we're talking about DOGE and the chainsaw and if our country has fiscal footing to stand on. So, easy, light, fun topics. Let's get started. I'm here with Jessica Riedl to talk about the budget and DOGE. Jessica, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
You have been the budget guru for as long as I can remember. You started, I believe, in Washington at the Heritage Foundation, which is the place of the infamous Project 2025, which we'll talk about. But now you're at the Manhattan Institute in New York, and you've been there for a while, so your footprint is really all across the Acela corridor. And you know a thing or two about the budget and the right way and wrong way to go about fixing it. You've been involved in too many Republican presidential campaigns for me to remember. If anyone needs counsel about the budget situation, I'd argue it's this one. So let's get started. President Biden is out of office. Republicans control the House and the Senate. Trump is in the White House. Are we now on our way to balancing the budget?
We are further than we've ever been, it seems like. This year, the deficit is about $1.8 trillion, which is about 5% of the economy. It was $580 billion the last time Trump entered the White House in 2017.
Wow.
And it's going to get worse before it gets better, because if we just keep doing what we're doing, extending current policies, which essentially says just keep running the government as we run it today, the deficit is going to double to $3.6 trillion in a decade. And if we add additional tax cuts, additional spending, if interest rates rise, we're looking at deficits well over $4 trillion a year within the next decade. So I wish I could say things are getting better, but we're really going the wrong direction.
And what worries you, because those are big numbers, those are worrying numbers, but you look around and, we're recording this in the middle of Trump's Liberation Day tariff week, so things are a little up and down. But normally we've been in a significant budget deficit for a long time, and life is kind of continuing on as normal. So what does this mean? Why should people be concerned about this?
I think we've gotten a taste of the effects of bad budget policies a couple of years ago when we were coming out of a recession and President Biden shot a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan into a supply-constrained economy. Economists warned that this would bring higher inflation. We were already going to face higher inflation coming out of the recession, probably 5 or 6%, but the American Rescue Plan helped push inflation to 9%. And we have had inflation problems ever since. Interest rates haven't come back all the way down ever since. But that's really just a taste. I think economically, the danger is not that we're going to have an economic collapse next week. It's that what matters to economists is the total debt as a share of the economy, which for a family is kind of like your mortgage as a share of your income. The debt was 40% of the economy most of the post-World War II period. It jumped up to 100% of the economy since 2008. And depending on interest rates, it's going to 250 to 300% of the economy over the next couple decades under current policies. No other country has done this. You can't have a debt that high. Japan has been kind of in the neighborhood. They've been essentially in a 30-year recession. And so if the debt gets that high, you start to have chances of a major collapse. So the idea is not that we're going to have a crisis now at 100% necessarily. The point is that if you want to avoid a crisis in 10, 15, 20 years, you can't wait until the debt is that high. It's too late. You have to start putting in reforms now, because if you do it then, it's going to have to be way too drastic and way too painful. So, you can only escape the laws of economics for so long. The bill is going to come.
I want to talk about that bill coming because this is, I think, once people grasp how serious the situation is, that's kind of when the finger pointing begins. And you mentioned the spending that happened post-COVID in the Biden administration. And just to clarify for our listeners, there were a lot of bipartisan stimulus packages that were happening right after COVID happened when the economy was in a recession. But what was egregious, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jessica, was that the Biden stimulus package came kind of after we were already recovering and was unnecessary to stabilize the economy and just, pumped up inflation. Is that right?
The Biden stimulus came just about 8 weeks after another $900 billion bill that was done in the last days of the Trump administration. And that was the point when the economy had really started to turn the corner. So broadly, to get into this question of what happened, we can go back even further. Some people who are as old as I am remember in 2000, we had a budget surplus. And the big question was, what do we do with this $5 trillion surplus over the next 10 years? That was what they were arguing about when Bush was running for president against Al Gore.
Yeah.
Well, since then, we've gone from about a 2% of GDP surplus to about a 6 or 7% of GDP deficit. What happened? Well, spending rose by about 6% of GDP, mostly Social Security and healthcare. We cut taxes by 2% of GDP, and the economy is responsible for 1% of GDP during that time. So everything's contributed. It's been mostly Social Security and healthcare, but there have been tax cuts too. And then it's accelerated in the last couple of years. Trump signed legislation adding $7.8 trillion to 10-year deficits. Biden signed legislation adding about $5 trillion in 10-year deficits. And now you have Social Security and Medicare driving us moving forward.
I think the point you're making, or what I'm hearing, because then I think to the extent that Republicans lay this at Biden's feet or the Democratic Party's feet or Obama, and it's spending and new government programs and a bloated federal workforce, I feel like Democrats, and also rightly, point to Republican policy and say, you've cut taxes that haven't been paid for, and businesses, and that also got us here too. No one's reformed the entitlement programs which are driving this. And so is it fair to say that kind of everyone has stuff on their hands, for lack of a better word, who've gotten us into this mess?
There is enough bipartisan blame to go around. Again, Republicans beat up Democrat spending bills, but, Republicans cut taxes in 2001. They cut taxes in 2017. And Republicans increased spending as well. When Trump got elected in 2017, he had a Republican Congress. And in addition to cutting taxes, they hiked discretionary appropriations by 15% in 1 year. This is a Republican government. But there's also been a lot of debt that's been bipartisan because a lot of the debt in the last 20 years came out of the Great Recession and its response, and COVID and the response to that. And whenever we've had two major economic crises in the past 20 years, and both times the parties panic and pass huge bills. Maybe those bills are needed, in a Keynesian way, but the bill is still real, and the contribution to the debt is still real.
That's an important point, and I want to talk about what to do with DOGE and the impact of tariffs and taxes and interest rates and all of that. But I just want to focus in there because it's actually the ability for the federal government to take on debt is a really important feature of our government. States have to balance their budgets, families do, but the federal government has this kind of safety net and ability to continue to borrow and not pay for it. Can you explain why that is and why that's a good idea, at least for certain types of spending?
Sure, because when there's a recession or a war, it's really hard to balance the budget, and it's probably not the right time to do so. When there is a recession, tax revenues dry up because fewer people are working. And costs rise because you have more people collecting unemployment benefits and food stamps and all of those benefits.
Sure.
Economists would tell you that's precisely the wrong time to raise taxes when you're in a temporary recession. Similarly,
Totally.
when there are times where you're at war, you can't raise taxes high enough to pay for the war costs, and the economic effects would undermine your country's ability to finance the war. But the flip side of we have crises where you have to run deficits is an expectation that when the war is over and when the economy is growing, you'll bring down the deficits, you'll balance the budget, you'll even run surpluses. The idea is that you should be able to balance the budget over the long term, even if you're going to have some ups and downs. And what's scary about where we are now is we're at 1.8 trillion under peace and prosperity. Prosperity up until a couple weeks ago. We have a deficit going to 3 to 4 trillion a year under peace and prosperity. Because if we have a recession on top of that, or a war on top of that, then it really goes high.
Well, let's talk about what to do about it. And let's start, of course, with DOGE. It feels like a black box to a lot of us. Is it legal? Is what it's been doing legal? What exactly has it been doing? Can you talk to us about DOGE, how to think about it?
Yeah. When DOGE began, Elon Musk promised that they were going to cut $2 trillion out of a $7 trillion budget. Then he humbly reduced it to $1 trillion out of a $7 trillion budget. But those numbers were never realistic because 75% of all federal spending goes to 6 items: Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, defense, veterans, and interest. And much of that is off the table. Trump doesn't want to touch Social Security and Medicare, and Republicans don't want to touch defense and veterans. You can't directly touch interest. So there was really no way you were going to cut $1 trillion or $2 trillion out of the remaining programs. Beyond that, Elon Musk and the DOGE website keep putting these calculators. We've cut $140 billion, so far, but they haven't verified it. If you actually look at their wall of receipts and go through it, they've only produced about $2 billion in verified savings. Instead, you have huge mathematical and accounting errors on their website. Things like cutting $8 million and accidentally counting it as $8 billion, or triple counting the same cut, or cutting spending that never existed, or cutting spending that expired 20 years ago. When you clear it all out, they've cut about 1/35 of 1% of federal spending. And even that may be illegal, because the reality is, if Congress passes legislation saying the USAID will spend $50 billion on these items, the White House and the executive branch are legally required to spend $50 billion on those items. They can move money around, they can cancel contracts, they have to spend $50 billion. So even the cuts that have been made may end up being reversed in the courts as an impoundment, which is a unilateral presidential cut of spending that Congress has already approved. So the savings are small and it's illegal. But ultimately, I think this is by design. I consider DOGE to be government spending cut theater, because when you look at what they're going after, DEI contracts, Politico subscriptions, federal employees, foreign aid, there are not much savings in any of those. But those are culture war totems for the MAGA base. And so I think the idea is more to excite the MAGA base than to actually save money.
Yeah, and on that train of thought, I remember in his address to Congress the other month, President Trump mentioned that Social Security payments are going to essentially a bunch of dead or very old people, like people who are 300 years old. Is that part of the theater? Is that true? Are we able to find and get rid of billions and if not $1 trillion of waste and fraud and abuse?
Budget nerds like me pull our hair out every day. There's so much misinformation being spread by DOGE. They claimed that we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars to dead people on Social Security because Elon Musk misread a database.
No.
They falsely claimed that the federal government sent Gaza 1.5 billion condoms at a cost of $50 million. This is not true.
Well, and Jessica, just to stop you there, like, how do people know if it's true or not true? Because we're living in an environment where if you listen to certain news sources, that's what you're saying is right. If you listen to other news sources, what DOGE and Musk is saying and right. Like, how is the normal person in flyover country supposed to know? Like, are these legit numbers? They don't have time between watching their kids and their day job to sort this all out.
I think that's part of a balanced media diet, because you hear one media organization report these lines, but then you might find the other side's media do a full fact check. For instance, the 1.5 billion condoms supposedly sent to Gaza at a cost of $50 million actually turned out to be a $50 million grant to address AIDS in a region in Mozambique called Gaza. And somebody in the White House misread the Gaza in Mozambique for the Gaza in the Middle East and thought fighting AIDS meant sending them condoms. And if you have a balanced media diet, you're going to see one side make an accusation without backing it up and another side producing a huge fact check. And then you might get a holistic picture. Unfortunately, though, you're asking a lot of people to consume that much diverse media when they're busy with their job and their kids. You know, the fact that you can't just go to one place and trust it anymore is a big problem.
It's so sad. Well, let's talk about other ways. So I'm hearing you say DOGE is theater, the cuts they find, even maybe the legitimate ones aren't necessarily material, by which I mean they will have almost zero impact on the scale of the federal debt that we're in. What about the impact of a few other things? I want to talk about the impact of tariffs and taxes and economic growth in the budget. So let's start with tariffs. President Trump has said that the money we'll get now from his really unilateral tariffs will help offset our deficit. True or false, and why?
Well, first, let me just plug my article yesterday. It was yesterday. There was the headline article on MSNBC all day was my 1,300-word review of the Trump tariffs and why I believe they're very destructive. They're not going to raise much money. They're not going to save the deficit. To walk through it, the import tax base, the amount of imports that come in every year that would be subject to a tariff, is about $3.2 trillion. So
seems like a lot of money.
A 20% tariff on average, 10% for some countries, 54% on China, would theoretically raise $640 billion. The problem is the whole point of tariffs is to get people to stop buying imports. So if they stop buying the imports, you're not going to raise the money.
Right.
On top of that, you're going to have all sorts of retaliation and economic losses across the economy, which is going to reduce tax revenues as people lose their jobs. So right there, you may go from $640 billion down to $200 billion. And you might say, well, $200 billion is still something, except for the fact that when we had tariffs last time under President Trump, 97% of the tariff revenue went to bailing out farmers and other individuals in export industries who were harmed by the tariffs. And we're already seeing farmers getting bailed out again from the trade war effects of these tariffs. So by the time you've bailed them out, the deficit reduction is almost zero. And it's certainly not worth the economic cost. So I wish you could say that despite all pain, at least the tariffs are cutting the deficit. They're really not.
Well, that's depressing. Let's talk about the impact of taxes on the budget, because there's a big tax bill that's coming up this spring. It is an extension of many parts of the tax legislation that was in 2017 under the first Trump administration. And I think Republicans in particular would say this will help economic growth. It's reducing the burden on individuals and companies and giving cash to families. And so we understand tariffs might help, might hurt, might not do anything to the deficit. But man, this tax bill, when we get this through, we have economic growth, and that will rebalance our fiscal portfolio. What do you think?
Tax cuts do not pay for themselves, despite what Republicans may tell you, except in the rarest of circumstances. What Trump is wanting right now is about $6 or $7 trillion in 10-year tax cuts. Not just extending the expiring 2017 tax cuts, but no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits.
Yeah.
The effect of these tax cuts, it's not gonna increase economic growth very much. And that's because, well, the TCJA already exists. Renewing current tax cuts isn't a change in tax policy. It just means we're going to keep taxes the way they are today, which means you're probably going to get normal economic growth. You're not going to get a big surge. The no taxes on tips and overtime and Social Security benefits are also not the kind of tax cuts that are expected to increase economic growth very broadly. So ultimately, I like tax cuts. I'm a fiscal conservative. I would love taxes to be as low as they can be sustainably. Keyword being sustainably. The problem is when you're not cutting spending and you already have a $1.8 trillion deficit, these are the policies that push deficits towards $3 to $4 trillion a year. This is why interest on the debt surpassed the cost of Medicaid in 2023, defense in 2024, and Medicare this year to become the second biggest item in the budget. We are going to spend so much on interest that we're going to bury ourselves.
Well, and let me run some counter programming on that, because potentially, what if we go into a slight recession, either as part of the business cycle or the tariffs, and all of a sudden the Fed's they're gonna lower rates, right? They want more money out into the system, and all of a sudden the Trump administration can say, "Remember how you couldn't get a mortgage under the Biden administration? Now rates are low, and our interest payments on the debt are lower." But we're also in a recession. So help us sort that out.
Ultimately, if the president's goal is to lower interest rates, a recession is a good way to do it.
Right?
I don't think that you're still not going to get a very good home loan, though, when you don't have a job. But ultimately,
right.
I think
it's important.
I think if the idea that we need to cut taxes to offset the economic danger of the tariffs avoids the obvious answer of why not just get rid of the tariffs? Instead of, we're going to blow up the deficit in order to give you back some of the $4,000 your household is losing this year to the tariffs. First off, that would be a huge tax cut. We could just get rid of the darn tariffs instead.
Well, it makes sense when you say it, Jessica. Let's go kind of rapid fire through potential other solutions, like balanced budget amendment. That's always, I was a Senate staffer 15 years ago. It always comes up, I feel like, in every Congress. Is that a good idea, bad idea? What does it do?
A balanced budget amendment is probably a bad idea because, again, during wars and recessions, you're going to have exceptions. And most balanced budget amendment ideas have exceptions for war and recession, but ultimately, Congress would probably just declare war and recession every year. The other issue with a balanced budget amendment is I don't know how Congress would balance the budget in the short term. I've proposed more stabilizing the debt at 100% of the GDP current level, and that allows deficits of about 2 to 3% of GDP per year.
I like that idea. What about the debt limit? Because we're going to hear a debate about that again this summer. It feels in some ways like it's this wonky political tool that actually brings the U.S. to the brink of default more frequently than would be nice. Others say it's a leveraging tool and it's just a natural check in the system on our spending. Do we get rid of the debt limit? Is this helpful? Is it arcane? Thoughts?
Historically, the debt limit has helped keep spending and deficits down. In fact, the 9 largest spending or deficit reduction bills since 1985 were all attached to debt limit legislation. Every one of them. The
Wow.
Graham-Rudman laws of 85, the George H.W. Bush read my lips tax hikes in 1990, the Budget Control Act in 2021, every one of them was attached to a debt limit hike. So it's been useful in the past, at least motivating Congress to say, look, we're going to raise the debt limit, but let's try to fix the problem. The challenge is, in the last 10 years, the debt limit has basically stopped being effective. Other than the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2 years ago, which put in some spending caps, Congress no longer really uses the debt limit in order to reduce the deficit like they used to. So my preference would be stop risking our ability to pay interest on our debt, stop risking default, and replace the debt limit with something else that can help constrain long-term deficits, like a cap on the debt. Like if we had a law capping the debt at 100% of GDP over the business cycle or something like that, we would still have something to address deficits without risking the full faith and credit of the federal government.
And how would that, just very, very briefly, how would that work in practice? If we had a law like that in place and now we're going into a tax debate this spring, like how does that law have any teeth?
Yeah, there would have to be some sort of legislation essentially projecting out the debt as a share of GDP over 10 years under a normal economy, and then some sort of rule against any legislation that would increase deficits above that level during that period. And, again, I say over the business cycle so that if you go over a little bit in recession, it's okay as long as you go, as long as you catch up later. You can do that by going by potential GDP instead of the actual GDP. Potential GDP, for non-economists out there, is just what the economy would be if we weren't in a recession. So you can do this. This is Congress can design this if they want.
Okay, it's up for the taking. Attention, Congress. All right, Jessica, to close us, I normally ask what talking point, because this is beyond talking points, what talking point about the budget drives you nuts? And I'm guessing you, of all people, have a few. So can you tell me some of the talking points that drive you crazy in the space you work in?
I wrote a full cover story in Reason last summer about, in budget deficits, everybody has one cool trick on how to balance the budget. Those are the talking points that drive me crazy. When people say, on the left, if you just tax the rich and cut defense, we can balance the budget. On the right, if you just stop funding Ukraine and foreigners and immigrants and welfare, you can balance the budget. Everybody has their one cool trick that if you just do the one partisan thing that I want to do that won't hurt me, but it'll just hit the other side, then we don't have to put everything on the table. We don't have to do the hard stuff. If they just do this, the problem is solved. It pulls my hair out because that's why we can't solve the problem, because everybody's married to their one cool trick that doesn't come close to solving the problem.
Yeah. Well, that's a great one to end it on. Jessica, you write for, I think in the course of this conversation, you've had a piece for MSNBC, for Reason, Heritage, you're at the Manhattan Institute. You can do it all across parties and really cut through the mess to make sense of what's going on with the budget. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
This has been really fun. Thank you so much, Abby.
I'm Abby McCloskey, and this is Beyond Talking Points, where we talk about what America was promised and what we're getting. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you next week.